What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome back to Datasheet Deep Dive. This is the Warhammer 40k video series where we take a datasheet in the game and analyze it to an unnecessary degree. Although today we're going to be doing something a little bit different, because the datasheet that we're going to be discussing is one that I really want to talk about because it's extremely unique, but there's not a lot of synergy within the faction itself, which is usually something that we get into pretty hard in this series. So instead, what I'm going to do is get into a little bit of lore and background material before reviewing the datasheet of the Deathstrike missile launcher from Astra Militarum. This is definitely a departure from my normal style of content, so if you like this, let me know down in the comments below. Hit like on the video and subscribe on the channel, all the YouTube stuff. You know the drill, and let's dive in to this weird and wacky unit. So first off, a little bit of background about exactly what a Deathstrike missile launcher is. It is this enormous and funky looking top-heavy device that fires an enormous intercontinental ballistic missile across the battlefield. In contemporary terms, it is a transporter erector launcher, meaning that it's a vehicle that transports a missile or rocket and then has a system by which it erects that rocket into a position to fire, and then also is capable of launching it independently. It fires ballistic missiles at incredible ranges with incredible accuracy. These launchers fire ballistic missiles with a wide variety of payload types for both strategic and tactical operations. They're hilariously overpowered for the scale of combat that we have in Warhammer 40k, the tabletop game, since they're canonically able to hit targets accurately anywhere on the same planet on which they're operating. That's importantly why the Deathstrike missile launcher itself does not have a limit on its range, but we do have the limit of the size of the battlefield you're playing Warhammer 40k on, which typically tends to be a 44 by 60 table. That's much smaller than the normal range that you could fire an ICBM. I'm not a rocket surgeon, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. The launcher itself and the unit that is used on the tabletop is based on a Chimera APC, and it's just a delivery system for the big missile. These missiles are able to mount a wide variety of payloads for specialized tasks, including conventional nukes, plasma warheads, and vortex missiles, the most exciting one that everyone remembers for ripping holes in reality and functioning basically like black hole bombs. Anyone within the vicinity of the aura is going to get sucked in, and they typically persist for a really long time, mutating and disrupting all of the reality around them. Other payloads also include some more exotic and specialized examples like harpoon missiles that are specifically designed to surgically penetrate and disable Titan enemies, soulfire missiles that concentrate a plasma charge into a single point on the battlefield to immolate specific targets in a blistering fusion reaction, or stasis missiles that just, they stop time. Leave it up to the Imperium of Man to possess the ability to manipulate time and just load it into a projectile and shoot it at people. There's certainly no other far-reaching applications with much deeper connotations of that technology than using it to shoot at enemies. My favorite of all of the different types of missiles that Deathstrike missile launchers can load is the warp missile, which is distinctly different from the vortex missile. Whereas vortex missiles use warp energy as their payload, the warp missile instead has a warp drive within the device in addition to its conventional rockets. This lets the projectile warp inside its target before detonating with big explosions, and begs the eternal question, why do we make it a rocket? If we could just warp it into people, why did we put a rocket engine on it? It doesn't make sense. The Deathstrike missile launcher as a unit got its start in the first edition of the Warhammer 40k Epic game. This is the little 6mm variety of 40k that you might have seen around. It has a lot of classic inspirations for a lot of units, including most of the Titans in the game. And the only reason I mention that in this case is, look at this little guy. He's so cute. The original Deathstrike missile launcher might be the most adorable model I've ever seen, especially with the tiny little face painted on the rocket itself. It's real flying bomb energy here, except I'm pretty sure that the launcher is just carrying an actual space shuttle. That's just a space shuttle on the back of that thing, I'm pretty sure. An adorable space shuttle with a tiny little shark face. This model actually existed. You can actually still buy them on eBay, which is absolutely great. What a classic. All right, so all that fluffy stuff out of the way, let's talk about the datasheet. Now, the Deathstrike launcher, like I mentioned up at the top, is basically just a Chimera APC. While it is a little slower, all of its other base stats are the same. It is only move 10 at its top bracket, unlike the Chimera's top move of 12, but obviously it is weighed down by that big, dumb missile on the back. So it's understandable. We can cut the Deathstrike launcher a bit of a break. There's a 4+ ballistic skill, and importantly, does not have access to any turret weapons, so there's no way for that ballistic skill to be improved by getting +1 on one or more of the weapons on its profile. Instead, it just has one hull-mounted weapon it's going to be using that ballistic skill to fire with. Its other important stats are a respectable toughness of 7 with 11 wounds and a 3+ save. Pretty stock standard vehicle chassis. In fact, we call this the vehicle equivalent profile, given that if you're trying to math how much damage you'll do to an average vehicle in 40k, this is basically the profile you use. It is dead average. I love the war gear readout for the Deathstrike. It has a heavy bolter on it, but also the Deathstrike missile. But unlike conventional weapons, the rules for the Deathstrike missile are described in abilities section. It's not a piece of war gear, but we're gonna put it in the war gear section anyway. You can swap out the heavy bolter for a heavy flamer if you want to be shooting at closer range, although given the fact that the Deathstrike missile launcher, as mentioned before, has an unlimited range, you probably want to be keeping it as far away from your opponents as possible. In addition, keeping it alive is actually going to be pretty important for use of the Deathstrike missile launcher for reasons that we'll talk about as we get into the mechanics of its missile system. So not only do you want to use range and line of sight blockers to do that, making a longer range weapon probably a little bit more useful for this particular vehicle, but also it has some options for war gear to make it more survivable. The first one being the Dozer Blade. This one allows it to ignore modifiers to its move or advance and charge rolls. That one doesn't really matter. You're probably not moving your Deathstrike missile launcher all that much. The most important one, I think, is Armored Tracks, which gives it the armored ability of +1 save against damage 1 weapons, giving it a 2+ save against those small arms fire. Now, it's probably not going to be taking too much damage from small arms fire, given that it's going to be basically as far away from your opponent's army as physically possible, but it also gives access to the ablative plating stratagem, which allows you to spend 2 CP to get -1 damage. So if your opponent has long-reaching attack, and especially attacks with a decent punch, like 2 or 3 damage anti-tank weapons, you can use that to probably survive. Importantly, the Deathstrike also has the smoke keyword. It has smoke launchers on it, so you can spend a CP for smoke screen to give it -1 to be hit. All right, with all that out of the way, let's talk about exactly how this Deathstrike warhead works. The Deathstrike missile has a varied payload, and you actually do not choose the payload when you add the Deathstrike missile launcher to your army like you would normal war gear. Instead, after you see your opponent's army roster before your game begins, you can choose what payload you're going to be loading into your Deathstrike missile system. We'll talk about the effects of each of the different warhead types as we move on, but the most important difference between them is going to be the radius at which they affect enemy units. So you can either do more damage at a smaller aura or widen the aura significantly to do much less damage, but obviously spread out that effect over a wider area of the table. Now, firing the missile launcher is a multi-step process. You got the 2 guys in there, they both have their little keys, and they both have to turn them. There's probably a red button somewhere and a suitcase with some codes that only the Lord Solars have access to. That's a piece of lore that I read, so that's good. The way that this works on the tabletop is through use of the align target action, which all Deathstrike missile launchers have access to. In fact, multiple of them can perform the action every turn. So unlike most actions that are restricted to being performed one at a time, this one can actually be performed multiple times. It requires that your Deathstrike model not have fired their missile already this game, begins in your command phase, and ends at the end of your turn, meaning that that Deathstrike is not going to be able to move or shoot as long as they are aligning the target of their missile. Once the action is completed, so at the end of your turn, you don't have to decide where the missile is going until the end of your turn. So if you can see how much damage you do during your shooting and fighting phases, then once the turn ticks over, you get to place your marker down after that. You can either place the Deathstrike target marker anywhere on the battlefield, or if you already have a Deathstrike target marker on the battlefield, you can move it to another position. Now, interestingly, aligning the target for the missile does not automatically fire the missile. That's a second step of the process. This is basically just the guys in the tank inputting the coordinates of where they want the missile to go, and then they can choose to fire it later on in the game. That's using a second ability, the launch missile ability, which says that in your shooting phase, when the Deathstrike is selected selected to shoot. If it's not in engagement range of enemy units, its target marker is on the table and it has not yet launched its missile, you can then fire the missile and resolve its effect immediately. So the reason that I say that it's important you keep your Deathstrike alive is that it's going to take you a full turn to complete the action to align the target of its missile launcher. Not moving, not shooting, not engaging with enemies at all. You then place the marker and your opponent gets a turn to react to it. If they kill the Deathstrike before your next shooting phase, the Deathstrike is never selected to shoot, so it will never be able to resolve the effect of its missile. Another important thing to note is that obviously the missile is not automatically fired at this point. You can choose to just leave the marker there, not use the align target action again, move and do whatever you want with your Deathstrike, and leave that target marker until a future shooting phase in which you want to fire it. The target marker just means that the missile has been primed and is ready to go, and then that gives you the option to then fire at any of your subsequent shooting phases. I also really appreciate the counterplay here of being able to engage the Deathstrike missile launcher. So now, if you don't have the ability to outright kill it, if you can get something fast over there, you can touch it and stop it from firing that missile launcher off, disrupt its systems, knock out its targeting, do whatever, and force the Imperial Guard player to clear it off before they're able to actually fire, which could save you the damage from that big missile launch for another turn or two. All right, so now the part that everyone I think has actually been waiting for, the actual effect of the different Deathstrike missile payloads. The first one is the God Spear Warhead. This one hits everything within 3 inches of the center of the target marker. You roll a d6 for units within that radius. On a 2+, they take 8 mortal wounds. On a 4 or 5, they take 12. If you're lucky enough to roll a 6, it deals a massive 16 mortal wounds to that unit. After you finish rolling all of those, the target marker is removed from the battlefield. The unit has been considered to launch its missile, so it cannot replace a new target marker. It's done for the game. Now, obviously, this looks like a ton of damage, but realistically, between 8 and 12 mortal wounds within a little 6-inch diameter area means that your opponent essentially will just have to move their army out of that. No one in the game wants to take 8 mortal wounds, for sure. A lot of units can withstand it, especially if they're like a 10 model infantry squad or even a 10 wound tactical marine squad, something like that, and they take 8 mortal wounds. They're not going to be removed. This means that it's possible for a lot of chaff enemy units to actually tank the hit from the Godspear Warhead, stand within the radius, and this gives them a 50-50 chance of actually dying, so that's not the best. What you really want to be hitting with this is important stuff like enemy tanks and heavy vehicles. The downside, obviously, is the radius of the actual diameter of the explosion that happens. Just a 6-inch radius on the table is not even enough to capture the entirety of an objective marker, which means that you can't force your opponent to leave objective markers or take damage using the Godspear. What you can do, however, is use it to deny real estate to them. So if your opponent has a really good ruin or a position on an objective they want to be holding, you can place the Godspear such that it would hit that portion of the battlefield with the radius of the explosion, and that will actually force your opponent to either choose between leaving cover, leaving that area of the objective that they want to be utilizing, or take the damage. Relatively useful, but I think the use cases are going to be relatively minor. A lot of armies can move outside of a 6-inch area of the table and not be entirely destroyed. Now, the same thing can't be said for the second warhead type. This is the Plasma Barrage Warhead, and this one does exactly the opposite. It does a little bit of damage within an enormous area of the table. You roll a d6 for each unit within d3 plus 6 inches of the center of the target marker. This means it has a minimum of a 7-inch radius, a maximum of a 9. So between 14 and 18 inches diameter, which is actually huge. That's like most of a player's deployment zone. You make a similar roll to the Godspear Warhead, but subtract 1 from the result if the unit is an infantry character. Those guys can usually dodge big rockets and take less damage from them, so it's a little hard to snipe characters with this one, although the Godspear certainly could. On a 2 to 3, the unit suffers d3 plus 1 mortal wounds. On a 4 or 5, it takes 2 d3, and on a 6, it takes d3 plus 3 mortal wounds. Then the target marker is removed from the battlefield. Now, while this does sound like a lot of damage, the downside of this style of mortal wound application, and one of the reasons that bombing effects like this don't tend to be super widely played, is that sprinkling mortal wounds across a wide swath of your opponent's army actually is the least valuable way to be applying mortal wounds. What you want to be doing is removing units with those mortal wounds, not just weakening them. And because a lot of this damage is going to be applied to units that either you're going to overkill dramatically when battle is actually joined, or have so many wounds that you don't care about doing that much damage to them, or their characters or other, similar units, support units that can hide all game, and you're actually not going to get a good opportunity to kill. Dealing a little bit of mortal wounds to a lot of different units in your opponent's army actually doesn't tend to matter a huge amount. Now, obviously, having a 50-50 chance to do 2 D3 mortal wounds is pretty good, and a 1 in 6 to do D3 plus 3, and that still is an appreciable amount of damage. And I think the reason that the Plasma Barrage Warhead, in my opinion, is my pick for the best one. The other benefit of this one is that it encompasses an entire objective marker. This is so important because it forces your opponent to take that hit if they don't want to leave that objective and cede the scoring from it. There are a lot of units that actually aren't fast enough to leave the area of this target marker. Now, last but certainly not least, we have the most esoteric of the warhead types, the classic Vortex Warhead. Everyone's favorite. This one's a little bit weird. Instead of triggering as soon as you complete the launch missile ability, at the end of each of your shooting phases, if the target marker is still on the battlefield, roll a d6 for each unit within d3 plus 3 of the center. So this is a little bit larger than the God Spear. You're getting an additional d3 inches, and that is important because it puts your minimum radius to 4 inches rather than 3. And that means that you do get to hit the entirety of an objective marker. An objective marker plus the 3-inch control area around it is just a hair over 7.5 inches, and having a 4-inch radius, if you roll a 1 on your d3, means that you have a total diameter of 8, which means that you're going to encompass the entirety of that objective and force your opponent to take that damage. And I think that's probably the best use case for the Vortex Warhead, denying your opponent the use of one of their objectives unless they start to take bleed damage over time. The roll for each unit is similar to the other warheads, but does significantly less damage. On a 2+, you'll deal D3, on a 4+, D3 plus 1, and on a 6, 2d3. So this is basically tiered from one step down from how much damage the Plasma Barrage does. After that roll is completed, you then roll another d6, and on a 4+, the target marker actually remains on the table for another battle round. Importantly, it does note that you cannot then align target again to move the target marker somewhere else and move the effect of the Vortex Warhead. Now, because the Vortex Warhead continues to trigger at the end of each of your shooting phases, this means that if you roll that 4+, the turn previous, at the end of your next shooting phase, it's going to hit everything within that aura again. It's creating this big rift in space-time. Everyone's getting messed up for standing within it. Now, like I said, I think that area denial, and especially objective denial, is the best use case for the Vortex Warhead. The downside I have is, first off, the damage it does is relatively minor. But also the 4+ removed from the battlefield makes it totally a coin flip, which means you could be giving up a lot of guaranteed damage from using a Plasma Barrage or even a Godspear Warhead that you're not getting from the Vortex Warhead. The Vortex is basically baked in to be triggering one additional time to be of a similar power level, in my opinion, to the Plasma Barrage, but it's only a 50-50 chance that happens, and obviously the chance that it continues to go on after that gets lower and lower and lower as you continue to try to roll 4+. Now, obviously, if it triggers every turn of the game, your opponent's going to be pulling their hair out, and they're going to be having a really bad time eating a ton of mortal wounds, but the chance it does that is very low. Now, area denial is definitely the name of the game, basically regardless of which of these different types of warheads you're loading into your Deathstrike missile. Astra Militarum are going to be probably the game's preeminent shooting army for the foreseeable future. The biggest defense against armies like that, and Astra Militarum in specific, is hiding behind line of sight blockers and obscuring terrain so that Leman Russ and Rogel Dorn battle tanks don't shoot you off the table. The Deathstrike missile makes that very difficult to do, since they can designate an area of the table behind a piece of obscuring terrain or on an objective where if you stay there, you will take an enormous amount of damage from that indirect fire. Astra Militarum also tend to have indirect fire in addition to this, so being able to plow something for a bunch of mortal wounds from a Plasma Barrage or Godspear Warhead, and then also piling in damage from things like mortar teams, is going to be really painful to armies that are trying to hide from the Astra Militarum. Now, at a points cost of 160 points, I don't know if it's worth it to include this as a piece of useful technology, but I certainly think just getting in the head of your opponent and the mind games that the beeping red dot that is this little aligned target marker is playing on your opponent is maybe worth at least a portion of that cost. I think for added effect, you have to have the nuclear launch detected sound effect on your phone from StarCraft, and you play that every time you perform the aligned target action.
Nuclear launch detected.
But anyway, that's all I have to say about the Deathstrike missile launcher. Certainly one of the weirdest and wackiest units in the game of Warhammer 40k right now. One of the reasons I didn't talk about this thing's interaction with any sub-faction abilities and stuff like that is that it doesn't make conventional attacks. And a lot of Astra Militarum subfactions and stratagems and synergies are based around making conventional attacks. I mean, we could talk ad nauseum about how to buff its heavy bolter, but I don't think that's as exciting as delving into the mechanics of its Deathstrike missile. Let me know down in the comments if you would take a Deathstrike missile launcher in your Militarum army, or if you are dreading facing one in any of your games against Astra Militarum. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great. I love you. I'm going to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.